Huh? Good morning. Hello, dear colleagues, dear scientists, dear athletes and coaches. Welcome to the third day of our FISU conference. And this day is maybe not the most numerous in participants, but quantity is not always in correlation with quality. So let me introduce me by myself. I'm Agita Abele, FISU Educational Committee member. Also, I'm a professor of Latvian Academy of Sport Education. Also, I'm expert in sport science of Academy of Sciences in Latvia. And also, I'm president of Latvian University Sport Federation and international ISU judge and referee in figure skating. So it's not summer, but still it's sport. And now please let me introduce our first presenter. That's Professor of National Taiwan Sport University, Mr. Dongjin Huang. And he's already Dean of the College of Physical Education. And the theme is Sport and Social Development, a brief introduction. Please, Professor, 35 minutes is yours and stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tony Huang. I'm from National Taiwan Sport University. Today, I'm going to talk about sport and international development. I have to say it's a great honor to be here to make a presentation, and also special thanks to President Dai and also the Professor Dean, who was the former mayor of Taipei City, invite me as a keynote speakers, one of the keynote speakers. Actually, this issue is quite popular over the last 2 decades. But in Taiwan, it's getting more and more popular. More and more people to know those information about sport and international development. So today I just make a very brief introduction about the idea of sport and international development. Sometimes people, they don't use international development, they use sport for peace and development, or some people say sport for social development. Anyway, today I'm going to use sport and international development. Okay, next. I'm going to introduce myself last. No.
New York, 2003, during the General Assembly of the United Nations, a resolution on sport is submitted.
So this is about a film about United Nations.
It's a means to promote education,
they say 2004 is the year for the international year for the sport and physical education.
As the International Year of Sport and Physical Education.
I think sports is extremely important for personal development and growth. When young people learn to play together, they learn discipline, they learn to accept rules and play by the rules. There's an old saying, a community that plays together stays together.
Volunteers strive to implement the resolution on sport in some of the most dramatic situations.
They've lost their friends, they've lost their relatives. So they become here, they will make friends. I think playing is what will help them to improve their mental health. So in this place they will learn some things about life and how they can overcome their sorrow, how they can help each other. So I think, yeah, sure, it has a very good social role.
A lot of successful projects have been set up in refugee camps, for instance.
You take situations like in a refugee camp. These people who are depressed, uprooted, lost, if they get the chance to play together, to focus on the game, to laugh together, it uplifts their spirit. I think sports and sportsmen have capacity to raise awareness, to bring people together.
Sport helps me a lot. Basketball makes me healthier, and I have fun playing. That's what I believe. I don't know what the future holds for me, but I think I need to be ready for anything, for any situation. That's why I'm trying my best to become a good basketball player and to be an educated person, for my future.
Il y a des enfants ici qui, chaque fois, quand vous interrogez,
there are children here who every time you talk to them, they talked about war. And when they played games, they played with make-believe guns. They played at being soldiers. But when we introduced them to communication games, group games, little by little these same children tried to forget about playing guns and soldiers, and now they know that there are other games, peaceful games, games about living together. That's the kind of change in behavior I've seen here, thanks to sport.
ça fait comme une modification de comportement ici, grâce au sport.
When communication breaks down between communities, sometimes the one place they can still meet is on the football field.
Take a game like football, soccer. You learn to play with others. You play as a team. You coordinate with each other. And these are lessons that you can take with you throughout life.
Pour moi, ce match, c'était...
You see, this match means more to me than just football. It was the meeting of two communities which have been torn apart by tragic events. Two communities which no longer speak, with different religions. And this was very emotional. It was about more than solidarity. It was real generosity. And that's why this match was such a success. You see, the message is clear to me. It's yes to peace and no to hatred.
Et non à la haine.
We don't know each other, but if we play a soccer match, our relation automatically will be different. After playing 1 hour together, we learn to communicate each other without talking. So it's a way to communicate with the people and to have a different relation.
This is a good example how sport can bring people together. Sports unites them and brings people, communities from different countries, different nationalities, different tribes, religions together.
Sport as a means to promoting development and peace can help to achieve the Millennium Development Goals.
So you can see the film talk about how sport can help with, for those refugees and homeless people, and also for war victims. Actually, I think that there are some technical problems. I haven't finished my introduction, then jump to the film. Thank you. Now I start to introduce myself. Okay. Actually, I have done I earned my master degree from Royal University in England, and I also got my PhD degree from Stirling University in Scotland. My research, my major field of research is in the field of post-colonialism and sport. What I have done is sport in modern China, imperialism and post-colonialism. And over last year, and I have published several papers about sport history in Taiwan and also sport history in China. and also talk about the modernity of Dragon Ball race in Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan. This year, I just published one book chapter talk about Japanese cultural imperialism in Taiwan, about judo as an instrument of colonial conditioning. And I work with Professor J. Mengen. This book will be published by the end of this year. And that's my work. And actually, I published one book about sport revolution and the Beijing Olympics in London, which is based on my PhD thesis. Okay, next. So today I'm going to talk about introduction to sport organization and international development. Also, I will introduce the meaning of sport and definition of international development and what's the relation between sport and development. Also, I will introduce historical context of sport and development, and also will introduce contemporary concern of sport and international development. Then I will introduce some international sport organizations and few case studies. Then in the conclusion, I will talk about opportunities and limitations of sport and international development. So the first introduction, as I just showed you the film, UN declared 2005 is the International Year for the Sport and Physical Education. That means sport and physical education. It is quite important for our global society. And a lot of people, they think sport can become a powerful vehicle to achieve the millennium goal of UN, and also can create a very useful and non-political vehicle for the society through sport. So sport could be a very good tool for some social development work. So I will introduce what's the meaning of sport. A lot of people say the meaning of sport is maybe just a competition or just a modern games. People focus on the competition or for the health. Actually, very few people mention about the function of social change. Maybe sport can help to change society, to help people, to empower women, focus on their rights, and also focus on young people's education, which is very, very important for some developing society. So then the definition of international development. What's the definition of international development and characteristic of modern and traditional society, and what's the meaning of global south and the third world, and north and is south, it's not western. So in this point, then I will introduce international development is a wide concept concerning the level of development on an international scale. So nobody, a lot of people, they think they have, in particular for Western society, some countries, they think they have developed, then they have a very good experience of the development, then they are trying to copy the experience to some South country or the third world countries to just repeat those of that kind of experience to help people. But sometimes there are some conflicts between culture, different cultures and different society. So when we talk about international development, we have to be very carefully to think about some cultural differences. So this is another film to introduce what is the millennium goal for the international development. Then okay, as the film just mentioned about what's the international development, and when we talk about the idea, that means how to reduce poverty, disease, and also death rate in the world. Now I mentioned about the 6 major use of sport development projects. First is conflict resolution and intercultural understanding. Just make people to understand each other, reducing conflicts in certain areas. Also building physical, social, sport, and community infrastructure. In particular, so when we introduce sport to the other societies, maybe we will also help them to build some infrastructures. Also raising awareness, particularly through education. I think maybe we can use sport to develop an education, and also empowerment. Empowerment, that means empower women's rights in society. The direct impact on physical and psychological health. Already some evidence have proved that sport can reduce some mental disease and also some help people to improve their health. And also, sport can help economic development and poverty alleviation. This film is about power of sport in Zimbabwe. I'm not going to play the film because we don't have enough time. The fifth, I will talk about historical context of sport and development. As I mentioned before, when we talk about the idea of international development, sometimes we have to look back the history, in particular the historical context of history. Some country has been colonized by another countries. And also, modern sports, most of modern sport, spread out by some Western imperialism. As American historian Alan Goodman, in his book Gangs and Empire, mentioned about how modern sports spread out from Western society. And also there are some arguments concerned about the power relations between the donor and recipient. What's the argument about the donor and recipient? Because sometimes the donor trying to introduce their own sport or their own ideas to the other society. Perhaps recipients may not accept that kind of culture or sports. So we have to be careful to think about that kind of argument. And also, there are some new sporting forms for development in contemporary society. So on the left is Sport Revolution and the Beijing Olympics, my own book. Let's talk about how Western sport introduced to modern China through imperialism. Also on the right side is Beyond a Boundary, is a C.L.R. James book. Talk about how British sports introduced to Jamaica, about the cricket culture as well. So six, I will mention about contemporary concern of sport and international development. So a lot of people believe that the role of sport can be a potential engine for development, in particular. But however, very few research about this, about the spatial role of sport in our society. Very few, because people all know sport is important, it's good for health, but very few people provide more case studies or some evidence about the sport can improve the social development in some societies. So sport also can be viewed as inclusive because most of sport dominated by male, and also there are some problems about the popular culture. Anyway, when we talk about international development, we have to think about the equal rights and social inclusion in the society. So, sporting organization. Recently, IOC, FIFA, they put some focus on the sport and international development. They have some projects to help several countries to develop their sports. The first case is about the IOC.
Seven a.m. on Rodrigo de Freitas Lagoon in Rio de Janeiro. In 2016, this will be the impressive location of the rowing events at the Rio Olympic Games. But today, Olympian Anita de France is giving a special masterclass to the young athletes of the Brazilian under-20 rowing team. An executive board member of the International Olympic Committee, de France on this day has swapped her business suit for sports attire as part of a campaign in which Olympians give back to sport at the grassroots level. As captain of the bronze medal-winning American rowing team at the 1976 Olympic Games, de France has a wealth of experience and knowledge to pass on to the young athletes. It is often said that sport is a school of life. It teaches values such as excellence, friendship, solidarity, and fair play. Sport also promotes mutual understanding. It facilitates dialogue. It can be a catalyst for positive change and social cohesion. These are just some of the lessons rowing is providing these young athletes. De France, who became the first female vice president of the IOC in 1997, has long championed the benefits that sport can bring, in particular, opportunities for women, children and minorities. Today, it was this group of Olympic hopefuls that benefited from the experience and advice of an Olympian. With a little luck and a lot of hard work, in a few years it could be their turn to give back to sport.
I want to introduce the FIFA's case. Maybe Masare is a very good case about the sport development because Masare is one of the poorest areas in the world. You can see the film introduce how sport can help people improve their life.
My name is David Iru from Madara Youth Sports Association, MISA, in Kenya. MISA is a project that basically mobilizes the youth using football as a starting point, later incorporate other aspects of development, life skills, like environmental cleanups, HIV/AIDS awareness training, youth rights protection training, because many of them in the slum areas for years before MISA started had no proper role model. Football helps, it's what brings all the youth together. It's a group that attracts everyone. And as they join in, they realize that they can do more as youth, and they become peer counselors, they become mentors, and eventually they realize that they have a role to play in changing their community. There's a point where you have to clean up, to clean your own community. And this kind of helps you understand, okay, we need to also clean the environment. And the ones who are most active in doing cleanups, in training the others, we give them an incentive by paying their school fees. That kind of encourages others to continue. I joined MISA when I was a young boy, and it's been a long journey since then. And I look around and see all the benefiting in this work. It's worth it. This was a special day for MISA. Marcel and Michael Johnson visited MISA. All the kids were happy, as you can see. It was an exciting time. Michael Johnson left his shoe. His shoe had it on our shelves. It suddenly did. But everyone feel special, and everyone feel friends with the right people. The Laureate funding is key to the existence of MISA. We're also working with the laureates to develop a curriculum which we have developed now. Using our approach, this is basically the experience that we have that is been put on paper, and we're willing now to share that among other laureate partners or other people who are interested to set up a program like ours. I would say MISA is home. MISA is an example. MISA is an opportunity.
So you can see, MISA is one of the most successful case for the sport and international development. And also some case study to our major sport events and disability, gender, and young people, and also positive future. Disability and gender and young people cases include in the MISA's cases. So positive future is very interesting because it was introduced by the British, English Home Office, which is this project intends to reduce the using drugs of the young people. Since 2000, it is very successful cases. Now British government, they are trying to develop positive futures project to the other countries. So it's another case about disability inclusion in Samoa, and also about the young people and positive future. So, in the conclusion about the opportunities and limitations, I have introduced a lot of ideas of sport and international development, but it looks like very positive. Sport can help societies. But the problem is, sport is not panacea, cannot solve all the problems of society. So that's a limitation, because sometimes the society has some corruption and political problems. So you cannot say, oh, sport can help. Sometimes sport is a limitation. But however, it still brings some hope and opportunities for people in the society. In particular, empower women, youth people, and the minority people in the society, and also help them to get more education through sport. So I think the research and study of sport and international development is continuing and getting more and more popular. It will be very important in the next decade. So I think today I just introduced an idea about sport and international development. Thank you very much for your listening. Thank you.
Thank you again. And maybe some questions for you. And in this part, I'll pass the microphone to my colleague, Mr. Tim Ting. Maybe you can lead this answer and question section, please. And
thank you for Professor Wang's presentation on international development in sports. This is a typical example of works done by sports sociologists. I have to be sociologist too. I appreciate the concept, international development, and bringing opportunity to the people who actually disabled or underprivileged to compete in the world, sports. For example, in the United States, basketball, football, and baseball are becoming opportunities for minorities, especially players, to compete and create social mobility. For sociologists, we are always concerned with evils of society, such as high mortality for infants, and also for children, and equal opportunity for social mobility. I believe these opportunities can be created through sports, across the international community, and also within the society. Thank you.
thank you again. So maybe some questions from auditorium, please. That one question, please give us the microphone.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I am from Ecuador, and I am studying the transculturalism theory that is new in the research field. And I am wondering about what you mentioned about donor and recipient relation. in international relations of power. Because now in this theory of transculturalism, it's involved the globalization, and maybe we need to mix and to share and learn from others, like the international sport organizations that helps countries, especially in my region, in Ecuador, in Latin America. So I would like to know your opinion about this transculturalism, globalization, and the political power view.
That's a very good question, because when we talk about the political power and also donor and recipient relationship, we always mention about the colonial relationship, which is unequal. But it's not always, we cannot say, oh, all the situation is like colonial relationship. Sometimes we need some help from the other society. Something is positive. The problem is, I just mentioned about the book about Alan Goodman. His book about empires and games. In his book, he mentioned about that most of people, in particular in the third world country, a lot of people accept the Western sport culture, just nature. But in my study, I don't think it is nature, because it's a kind of value. People, how could you believe that kind of value? If you believe that kind of value, then you just accept it. But we have to consider an equal relationship between the culture, different cultures. So, for example, some donors introduce the sports projects to the other societies. Sometimes they didn't ask the local people what they need. They don't have any discussion. They just think, maybe they think it is important, but I think they need to have more dialogue with local people, and to understand each other. I think it is quite important. So what I want to say, my comments is just have more dialogue between donor and recipients. I hope it will be happen in the future. Thank you.
So maybe again some questions. So, if not, then I would like, together with your applause, I'll thank again very, very thank you for your involvement in sport and education. Thank you. Thank you. So, and now is the time to introduce next our lecturer. It's Michael Lechner, a very well-known professor in the world of economic science, and it might be also interesting. His group and he are currently also active in prediction of season outcomes of the German soccer Bundesliga 1 using a combining of simulation, ergonometric estimation, and machine learning tools. So, Professor of Ergonometrics, Director of Swiss Institute Empirical Economic Research at the University of St. Gallen, and his theme, Empirical Evidence on Educational Effects of Physical Activity. 3 examples. Let's take these 3 examples. Please, Professor, stage is yours.
Thanks very much for the nice introduction, and thanks very much to the Education Committee for having me here and giving me the chance to report about our research on that field. Before I will do so, let me try to put the talk in a little bit of broader perspective. In the previous presentation, you saw many positive, I would say, potential positive impacts of sports on quite a different fields here, in particular in development. But if you look at the literature, you see also many other fields also covering Western economies, educational effects, labor market effects, of course, all these big health effects. And the type of work we are doing is trying to figure out, is there actually hard empirical evidence for the effects? And if there is this type of hard empirical evidence for these effects, how big they are. So if you want to kind of put that in a newspaper like of language, the attempt is to kind of provide the basis for what we would call evidence-based policy. Because at the end of the day, to implement all these policies, you need public support, you need public money, you need taxpayers' money, and for this, it's usually much more effective and probably also worth doing it and justifying doing it, to look at the hard empirical evidence, because for taxpayers' money, there are always competing uses, right? You can do a social program, you can foster sports, you can do whatever, many things. And therefore what we want to know is what's kind of the hard scientific evidence for these type of effects on the public money. So we, in our type of research, we try to provide evidence at that level. And I also have to mention in the very beginning, the evidence I'm going to present to you will be restricted in at least 2 dimensions, if not more. First of all the evidence coming now is for Western, what the previous speaker called the Western societies or developed societies. Excuse me. And I'm concentrating on one part of the evidence where I think not too much is known so far, in particular not too many hard facts are available right now, and that relates to education and younger individuals. So that's kind of the pretext of what's coming now. Let me see. Yes. So to be more precise, one more comment. In case you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me whenever you want. Right? So where I'm coming from, I'm used to kind of continuous interruption of talk, so that would be perfectly fine. You can disagree any moment you like. Okay. What's the question of the talk now more precisely? What we're interested in here in this lecture is the general question on the effect of physical activity on children, or be more precise, on younger people. So children, adolescents, and young adults. And if you look at what we know so far, I mean, there are for sure important aspects. Probably the most important aspect for sure is health. Right? There's a huge literature on that. But there's also this other aspect that's coming with human and social capital formation. From the language I'm using, you already see I'm an economist, so we talk about human capital, social capital, and all these things, meaning many things you saw in the previous presentation. So these are things like performance in the educational system, like non-cognitive skills, right? The advantage of measuring these type of effects of sports and physical activity is, from a very pragmatic point of view, also the fact that indeed this can be measured quite immediately. If you're interested in a labor market effect of a young kid doing sports, say at high school or wherever, then you need to wait years and years and see what's going on. Meanwhile, the circumstances have already changed. If you look directly at the educational effects, like the grades in that year, it's kind of the kind of measurement and all the sport activity and its effect is pretty well matched on the time scale. So when we look at the literature or what we know so far, the first thing is obviously health. Health and obesity identified as a big problem in the developing and the developed world. It's obviously highly relevant, and if you look at the studies, we have really good knowledge about this. There are still things, obviously there are still things missing, but the evidence, the empirical evidence, I would say, is very sound and very credible. And that's also important, right? You have many empirical studies, but then the question, should I believe in the study or not? In that field, certainly, I think there's very hard evidence that there are clearly positive effects on the health and obesity dimension. The open issues is still what type of physical activity would be most effective, what is the optimal level of physical activity, but there are always open issues. But nevertheless, we know a lot in that field. Once we go beyond that, knowledge kind of decreases, or the hard empirical evidence decreases. We have this suspicion that physical activity improves health, human and social capital, as I mentioned before. We also know that human and social capital formation, in particular in the early years, is very, very important for later success or whatever happens later on in life, right, including the health aspect, but also many, many other aspects like poverty, like labor market performance, and so on. When we think about how this come about, there are a couple of possibilities identified in the literature. Also for those effects, obviously there is the health channel, right? If you're healthy, it's much easier to learn and perform well at school. But there is a direct effect of sports. We conjectured that they exist like the team skills for team sports, like things like self-discipline, endurance, you have this list on the slide, and improved concentration, and related issues. And finally, there is the peer effect, which in many cases will also be a positive effect. But that's not, I would say, not a conclusive list, but that's probably the key drivers of any effect of sports in this human capital, social capital dimension. Why is it the case that the hard empirical evidence, as I said before, is limited here? I think it's what the statisticians call a selection effect. When you look at empirical studies correlating, say, success in school with activity, you always find something positive. So the more active you are, the better the grades. The better the grades, the more active you are. If you look at the labor market, it's the same thing. Higher earnings is related with higher activity. But to come to this kind of evidence-based policy theme, right, that knowledge is certainly not enough, because for the evidence-based policy, you want to make the point that increasing activity increases educational performance. And that's not a correlation. Right? So what you have to kind of disentangle in the data is what is the effect of increased activity and what comes just from the correlation of activity with other factors. And that's what we call in statistics and econometrics kind of disentangling a spurious correlation from a causal effect. Because obviously, if the observation that more activity also goes along with better education is kind of useless for an intervention, if the high activity is because of the good performance. You need the other causal relationship. And that's what we're trying to identify in these studies. And for this to being able to identify this is just not enough to kind of have a survey and kind of computer correlation, but we have to think of what we call research design, gradual research designs. One of those research designs you're going to see later on in the examples being an experiment. But there are others. Right? And those research designs there may be an optimal research design for a particular type of groups, because we know different groups have different ways of implementing things and so on. So I'm going to be more precise in a second of this. So what I will do in the rest of the talk, and as I mentioned, feel free to intervene whenever you like, is showing you 3 examples of our own work, not because I think our own work is much better than the work of other people, but because simply I know it best. So it's most easy for me to report on this one. And we're going to talk about the effects of 3 different types of young adults. So I'm going to start with the young children, kind of below 10, kindergarten to below 10. Then I'm talking about school children. And finally, probably the theme most closely related to FISU, the effects on university students. So let me start with the first paper. That is joint work with 2 of my former St. Gallen co-authors, I must say, so Christina Felber and Andreas Steinmeier. Christina Färb is now professor in Würzburg, Andreas Steinmeier a professor in Munich, but they have been at some point, a few years ago, they have been in St. Gallen in our team. So, title is Sports and Child Development. And the research question in that project was about the effects of sports participation on human capital accumulation of younger children outside school. Right? So not what we did in school, but what we did outside school. We do have now a huge literature with hard empirical evidence that interventions in very young kids may lead to very, very big effects later in life. This type of literature, at least in economics, started with the Nobel Prize winner Jim Heckman, but there are now many, many more studies really advocating you should make sure that the education in the very, very early ages is kind of well organized and substantive enough. And that evidence comes from developing countries as well as from the developed countries. So, given that kind of overall importance of young kids, we look at what's the effect of sports here for this particular group. What's known so far is essentially big kind of literature in psychology and pediatrics, but this literature measures the effect of children's physical and mental health. There are studies in economics, typically coming from the US, looking at the link of high school sports and later on professional success in the labor market, right? And that also points to positive effects. But there is a big gap in the literature on the educational effects for the small children. And we try, with that paper, we try to fill on that gap to some extent. The way we do it, it's what's called an observational study, so no experiment. We do use, I have to say, studies for Germany, so probably one of the most important restrictions. The studies for Germany based on a big, extensive survey that started as a cross-section and then became a panel data set, and it contains more than 6,000 children in the ages of 3 to 10. It's actually even larger. That's the part we are using here. And the beauty of that data set that is very informative on the physical activities, as well as many other background variables that measure the social environment, the educational environment of these children and their parents. In particular, and that's kind of difficult to obtain usually, there are good measures of the cognitive and non-cognitive skills of these kids. So there are test batteries that measure many of these things, and then this is matched also with information on the grades they attain in school. So you kind of have a very broad picture, broad and detailed picture on these kids, and it's supposed to be very representative for Germany. So that's the empirical basis of most of that paper, and there is also a second empirical basis. This being an observational study, is always better to have two representative data sets than one. And the second one is a smaller one. It's called the German Kinder panel. That's sort of a child panel, if you want to translate that in English. And that's a panel data set with 3 waves, but it's smaller than the kids. So you have the time dimension, but you lose a little bit on the cross-sectional dimension here. Essentially, the study is implemented in 2 ways. The first one is what's called in econometrics a matching approach. What you do there is you take out the differences between those kids, right? Essentially, you try to use statistic to thought experiment. You have 2 kids. They have different level of physical activity outside school, but they have the same background characteristics. So statistically, you change your data set such that you create something that looks like an experimental treatment and control group. Although there is no experiment. And you can do this once you have a very, very rich data set that contains all the relevant background variables. And that's essentially what this study do. And then the study uses also a second approach, which in econometrics we call instrumental variables, and that's an indirect approach. And here we exploit the fact that if you're living closer to a facility, like a football field, like a gymnastics hall, then it's cheaper, easier for you to attend courses in that hall, to play football with the team that is on that facility. That's easier if that thing is next door compared to having to travel 10 kilometers, for example. And that indirect approach is used as instrumental biology. That's what we essentially do in this study. Excuse me. The outcome, what do we find here, is generally positive. There are positive effects on cognitive and non-cognitive skills. So that means grades and all these other non-cognitive skills measured by these skill tests, or these batteries of testing. Positive effects, not surprisingly of course, on the health dimension, but also positive effect on the well-being dimension. Part of that being health, but part of that being something else, whatever it is. There is also a negative effect, which is not on the slide, which we found kind of interesting. There is a measurement of stress in the family that actually increases. And you can imagine also why that happens, because if the kids do lots of sports outside, then you have to carry them to the sports field, and so on, and so on, and so on. And that may have also negative impact on that dimension. The effects are not the same for everybody. I think they're kind of two important, or probably one important and one lesser important effect. The most important one, I think, is they are far more important in the city than in the countryside. Which from interventionist type of, or policy type of point of view may mean that you want to set up more programs in the city. The underlying logic is kind of clear, right? Those kids on the countryside, they're doing more physical activity anyway, even without formal sports education. When you live in the middle of the city, these things become more complicated, and the value of formal physical activity becomes higher. There's also seems to be somewhat larger this effect for the girls than for the boys, although kind of the real explanation for this is a little bit, I would say, a little bit in the dark. We just take this as an empirical observation without kind of theoretical reality. So that was the study on the young kids. And now we move a little bit further and go to school kids, school children. And this is a study with a PhD student of mine. Michael Knaus is just finishing his PhD. And Anne Reimers is a sports scientist, so not an economist at all. She's a sports scientist, and she was very much involved in getting the data for that study. She's now also a professor in a East German university. I think she's in Cottbus. So here we look, also opposed to the previous studies, not just older kids, but now we look at physical education in school. What you see on that slide is essentially 5 goals of sports curricula, which you find on the websites or publications of various international organizations, and then these goals are supporting cognitive development, fostering personal and social development, health of course, encourage active lifestyle out of the school, and improve the motor skills to enable participation in active society. The reason why I put them here on the slide is that the database, for that paper we were lucky enough to get a database that allows us to address all these issues essentially, which is kind of very rare because it's kind of difficult to measure. So the precise research question then boils down to how does physical education in school affect child development along those dimensions. I'm going to present you a pre-selection of those results only, of course, because time would not allow to go into the details here. Again, an observational study. Again, the same, part of it is the same data set as before, the KICS data, so these 6,000 kids. But now we merge this data set to a second survey that is performed, survey and objective measurements that is performed on parts of the KICS sample. That's called the motoric module of the KICS study. The beauty of this sub-data set is they have very extensive measurements of the motoric skills of these kids. And not via questionnaire, but via objective measurements, so they jump and do all sorts of things. It's very expensive, and therefore every wave takes 3 years in the field. and we're going to use two ways here. The reason why they invested so much money in that survey is obviously what you see on this slide. Therefore, what you get is a very good picture of what's going on here. And there are self-reported hours of physical education in school. That's one of the key inputs in the study. There is grades and there's information on the grades. There is what's called the strength and difficulties questionnaire for the non-cognitive skills, the subjective health-related outcomes. There is information on the extracurricular physical activity, and then there is the objective measures of the motoric skills, as well as lots of socio-demographic information on the kids, on their families, where they live, the social background of the region, and so on and so on and so on. It's kind of a really cool data set. At least for the type of study we had in mind. The complication, as before, is when we just correlate the numbers of our physical activity in school with the grades, there are issues here. And those issues obviously come from things like socio-economic background, but those issues also come from the school. It may then be that kind of rich parents choose better schools, or better schools are located towards the rich parents, in the neighborhoods of the rich parents. So that would again introduce this type of selection that almost by construction you're going to find positive effects of sports. So you want to take care of this, and for this you need all this social demographic background information to take out these effects here. And here what we do here is, because we believe that's probably not enough to account for school choice and all these issues, we take objective information from the legislation on the curriculum on physical education in school. And here, Germany comes into the game. This again is for Germany. In Germany, schooling is organized essentially by regional subunits called in Germany the Bundesländer or the federal states. And now in Germany there are 16 federal states, and they set up the curricula for the schools, essentially, with kind of more or less freedom for the particular school. And we're going to use this type of variation as kind of driving force of the estimation. And here you see one example. We essentially have 3 different scenarios in Germany. One scenario is that every kid has 2 hours of physical education per week. The second scenario is you have 3 hours, and the third one is that for some grades you have 2, and for some grades you have 3. And actually the fourth one is that a state changes this over time. That's the type of information we're going to use, and that cannot be influenced by parents usually. So that comes somewhere from outside. That's what econometricians call exogenous variation. So that's the name of the game of the study, and if we exploit that by doing some kind of more or less fancy statistics with it, we end up with those findings. Right? And the findings kind of similar to the previous study. There is an improvement in the grades all over the place, but there's also, again, a heterogeneity between boys and girls, and again in the direction that the girls seem to have, it seems to improve, or the effect on the girls seems to be larger than for the boys. That seems to be, that's kind of a common theme for the younger kids. In brackets, you may be aware of the fact there's now huge literature in educational economics or educational science in general, that how shall we deal with the fact that girls tend to do much better at school in developed countries, and try to mitigate the disadvantage of boys they have in school. But anyway, that's kind of a footnote. But similar issues pop up here in the sports dimension. And the second important heterogeneity is, this being Germany, you may be familiar with the fact that about a fourth of Germany was part of the Soviet bloc, if you want, up to 1990, so very different type of society on that part. And what we observe now, there are still in Germany substantial East-West differences. One East-West difference is the level of physical activity. The eastern part seems to be much less active than the western part. This as the background, what we find in this study, that the effects of increased physical activity in school for East Germany is considerably higher than for West Germany. And the explanation is probably the historical development of all this. Well, that's more a conjecture than the hard empirical fact. So these were the kids in school. What remains is the university. And that's the third paper, together with, again, two former PhD students who now become assistant professors in other parts of the world, Andreas Steinmeier and Hans Fricke. Andreas Steinmeier, the guy, also the core of the first study, is now in Munich. Hans Fricke is now in Stanford. And here we look at university students, and the question is, all these, I don't have to tell you, right? That's FISU. So all these universities offer facilities for their students, and the question is, what do these facilities? Are they just increasing the consumption value for the students? So is it just making the university more attractive because students find it cool to play football? Or actually are these facilities helping the students to perform better at university? That's kind of a very different size of that facility, and that's a very different motivation of spending either private money or taxpayers' money on building these rather expensive facilities. Right? So, and that's what we're trying to figure out in that study, at least to some extent. The literature again is kind of limited. We know from the US, and that literature is very much restricted to the US, that the college athletes in the US earn more. But the college athletes in the US university is typically something different than kind of the leisure physical activity for which these facilities are provided. And on these effects, there seems to be no literature so far, at least no literature which comes up with hard, credible empirical effects. So when we do this study, we have the same problem as before. Essentially, when you just look at university students, you find the better students do more sports. Whether this is an effect of sports, who knows? Right? That's just a correlation. So therefore, we have to come up with some way to figure that out. And the ideal way, obviously, would be we randomize. We form an interventionist group and a control group. One group does more sports, the other does less sports. This obviously doesn't work. You cannot prevent, at least in our universities, in I guess all universities, you would run into a problem if you kind of do not allow or restrict access of some students to the facilities, right? Even if that's random. So you have to come up with something else, since you cannot randomize the activity, and you have to do that in an indirect way, and we did it in an indirect way with the help of our university administration, in particular, one of the guys sitting there. So we came up with an RCT, so randomized controlled trial, where we randomized the incentives to participate. So essentially, we formed a random control group and a random intervention group, and the control group just got observed and nothing happened on that. For that group, for the intervention group, they got money. They got money for participating. Right? And each term they started up with potential money of 100 Swiss francs. Think about this as $100 US. Right? And they got the full amount if they attend the gym over 10 weeks, twice a week. When they do less, for each going below the two per week, we reduce it by 5. Right. So if you do not go at all, it's 0. If you go once a week, you get 50. If you go once a week for 5 weeks, you get 25. This type of thing. Right. So it's not, for St. Gallen standards, that's not a lot of money. That's in Switzerland. Right. And that's what we use. For this, we try to change the behavior of these people, and then later on figure out is there a measurable effect in their educational performance, in the grades they get, in the time to degree, and these kind of measures at the university. And for this we used data from the university, the administrative records, we conducted online surveys on those students, treated a control group, and then we also used scanner data to measure whether they entered the gym or not. So it's kind of a sort of big thing. What did we find? What did we find here? The first thing was that actually the incentive works. It raises participation by quite substantial amount. 30 to 50, I found that very substantial. It raises also the grades. To get a little bit more on that, what these numbers mean, one additional regular visit in the facility increases the grades by 0.6 standard deviation. That's kind of a common measure in educational science and economics, and that's huge. That's quite common what you think about interventions does, that's huge. And in this case, it's actually driven by the boys, the men, our male students. Interestingly, and that's the obvious question, how come? Is it that they get healthier? It seems not. The interesting channel here seems to be by inducing them to go to the gym, you induce them to stay longer on campus, and since we're on campus, we also go to my lecture. Which is kind of was a little bit unexpected mechanism, but is a mechanism that perfectly makes sense, and this kind of mechanism we got from the online survey. They asked them what would you do and how many minutes they spend on campus and traveling and all these kind of things. So there is a positive effect by making staying on the campus essentially more attractive, and therefore kind of consuming more of what professors and I guess also their co-workers do. So that was a quick summary of 3 research projects we concluded recently. And let me go to the overall conclusions and then stop. So first of all, in all these studies, for the young ones, the medium ones, and the older ones, we find positive effects of the additional activity. That's not obvious. There is this kind of circles, there is the issue more sports must be better. That's certainly not true. But if you stay 24 hours in the gym, you will not get good grades. So there is an optimal level. The fact that we find all these positive effects seems to suggest that the current levels are still far below that optimum. We also find that similar effects for the non-cognitive skills. And the last point here is a general remark. Obviously, there is a big trade-off between credibility and cost. To come up with credible empirical study is a hell of a lot of work. It's also costly. You may need randomized experiments. Randomized experiments are expensive per se. You may combine this with surveys. So to get good evidence is costly. There is no way around. Sometimes you're super lucky that there is a way around, but 99% there is no way around. There are of course many issues that I believe are still open in that literature and worth investigating in the future. We have essentially no clue about differential effects of different types of sports and activity. What is the return to football compared to weightlifting and all this kind of stuff? There is super limited. The evidence is super limited. Obviously, it's very difficult to get this because you need to have very large samples on them and think about how to randomize and all this kind of stuff. There is very limited evidence on the dose-response relationship. We have not really a clue what's the optimal. We kind of all believe that the current levels are too low, therefore increasing is a good idea, but we do not know what's the optimal point. So there's a big lack. Since I'm running out of time, kind of skip the next one. But let me re-mention the last one, that the studies so far do not really use what we know as big data. What we know as big data, whatever big data now means, essentially means there's a flood of data coming from, I don't know, these things here, the smaller things, and what have you. these studies not yet exploiting this. However, there is a big potential on using this. And also combining this with clever online randomized experiments. So I think in the future, the cost of gradable studies is going massively down because the available data goes massively up. This comes with a couple of other issues we all know from this kind of what's in the newspaper about the quality of the data, selective data, and so on and so on. But there's also a big future research field in this. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you for a great presentation. Thanks. Maybe some questions, please, for those interesting presentation. There were a lot of interesting economical aspects of the sports and student lifestyle. Please. So actually, I have one question. A lot of young people are completely involved in games, IT games, smartphone games, and even world championships were organized in this area. Electronic sports, is a sport or not? Your opinion?
I have no clue. Does it, you can kind of change your question, does this type of sport do the same thing that your own active participation does? I guess parts of the effects are also available there. If you form online teams, you may have the same type of team spirit that in a kind of real football game. I guess you're missing the probably health effects. I cannot imagine that it can be healthy sitting in a chair and kind of playing online games. So some of the effects will be there, others won't.
Okay, psychologically it is sport, but physically in the physical activity, physiologically not yet.
I guess that's probably a fair summary.
Okay, but so thank you. Maybe another question, please.
I have a question. In your data, did you control socio-economic status?
Yes.
You did. And what are the significant factors?
Sorry?
Are there significant impact?
Controlling for this, yes. Yes, yes. If you do not control for this socio-economic background, you always find huge positive effects.
So urban versus countryside, girls versus boys have the control.
Yeah. And kind of family wealth and family socio-economic status and all these kind of things.
So including migrant workers.
Sorry?
In a sample 6,000 survey, do you include migrant workers? Migrant workers?
Yes.
You do?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mayor?
Here.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really nice, and especially for me from St. Gallen, because I like your city very much, and the pictures on the screen, it was wonderful. In fact, I have two questions, if possible. Not probably about the students' activity in sport, but about kids or teenagers, because it's also the subject of your presentation. And while listening, I just noticed that you compared teenagers who live in the cities and in the village. And you mentioned and emphasized that it is more important for city teenagers. And what alternatives does exist for kids, for teenagers who live in the suburbs, in the villages, for sport activity? This is the first one. Thanks.
I guess the idea is here that if you live in the countryside, it's much easier to go to the next field and run around with your friends, play football on the next kind of whatever lone days. While in a built-up city, it's far more difficult to do these activities. You have to have a park or something more formal that this works. The alternatives are much. There are many more alternatives that may not necessarily relate to sports, but to physical activity. And since some of those effects come via the health channel.
But do you think that someone in this countryside should organize teenagers for their sports activity? Or following your answer, it means that teenagers and kids should do it themselves, or just with parents?
No, that would be a misunderstanding. What we found is the organized sports in the city and the countryside is positive, the effect of organized sport.
Yes,
but in the city it's larger.
And
So you want to have it in both, but probably more in the city.
Okay.
Thank you. And do we have time for another one? Just one
30 seconds.
I try to be short. My second question refers also to teenagers. And during your presentation, many times you talked about the great values, great benefits from the sports activity to kids. But very often, parents like me or many others can face with the situation when you push your kid to sports and he or she enjoys at first, but with years, he or she realizes that it can prevent some education or some classes in school. And when you reach a certain position in sport, probably not professional, but maybe in professional, the kid says, I want to stop and give up with everything. I don't want to go in for sports any longer because it prevents my school skills, and I prefer to be a good pupil, but not a good athlete. Do you know this situation?
Yeah. You also see that when you look at the aggregate data on kind of the activity levels. It's kind of, it increases with age. In Germany, up to about age 12, age 13, and then it goes down again. Our study was in the first part. So for that study, we looked at kids up to 10. So that was still where kind of the trade-off seemed not to be that sharp. But that's actually, these kids may be rational. It may be the trade-off between spending time in sports and spending time in school may change over the years, and later on it may be more worthwhile investing in making sure that you get able to go to university. I'm not saying this is irrational behavior, right? So,
okay.
Although parents may not like that, but...
Thank you.
So, thank you. And really last question, again, 30 seconds, please.
Je vous remercie. Je suis de la République centrafricaine. J'ai suivi avec beaucoup d'attention l'exposé présenté par le conférencier. Je m'en réjouis et l'en félicite. Mais la question que je voudrais poser, c'est par rapport à l'exemple suisse qu'il a donné tout à l'heure. À un moment, me disait-il, les étudiants ont été quelque peu intéressés du fait qu'on a donné quelques rétributions. Alors je me pose la question de savoir, est-ce que en donnant ce genre de rétribution, le facteur motivation ne devient pas beaucoup plus la recherche du gain que plutôt un intéressement qui tend à aider l'étudiant à pratiquer le sport pour se développer. La deuxième question, c'est de dire, lorsque vous avez parlé d'études, je m'excuse.
Just repeat the question.
Ok. Est-ce que sur l'exemple suisse qui a été donné tout à l'heure par rapport à l'intéressement qui est donné aux étudiants, est-ce qu'on ne tend pas beaucoup plus vers la recherche d'un gain plutôt que la recherche d'un développement du sport en milieu scolaire et universitaire? La deuxième question, c'est de savoir par rapport à l'étude qui a été faite, qui distingue nettement ceux qui pratiquent le sport par rapport à ceux qui ne le pratiquent pas. Est-ce que cette étude-là va aboutir sur la conclusion selon laquelle les capacités cognitives de ceux qui pratiquent le sport sont plus élevés que ceux qui ne pratiquent pas le sport. Merci.
Oh, okay. Thanks for the translation. I think, answering the second question first, I think yes. It comes out of a randomized control experiment. That proves it. What the kind of unknown, most speculative side is, why does it happen? But the result is safe, because it comes out of an RCT. The first question, is it that the students, or is it possible that the students go to the gym in the treatment group, in the interventionist group, just because they get the money and not because they like sports? Yes.
Why not?
That's what I expect. That's the whole idea, actually. To get to those guys who would not, to kind of make those guys who will not attend the gym, make them attend the gym because they want the money.
Yeah.
And then they find maybe it's nice, do more than they need to get the money. So that was the idea of the experiment, and why we used that cash incentive the way we did.
Okay. So, with your applause, I'll say thank you to our excellent presenter, Luis. So, now according to our time schedule, now we will continue with coffee break and poster session. The poster session will be moderated by Renata Boychuk, and all this event will be in same places like yesterday. So please enjoy the time today, 11 o'clock, and then will be started parallel sessions. Enjoy the coffee break, enjoy the poster presentation. Thank you.